Sleeping Stories.
In the depths of a city where darkness breathes and corruption flows through every street like poisoned water, two figures stood against an endless tide of evil. This is not merely a tale of heroes and villains. This is the story of a bond forged in blood and tragedy, a partnership that would redefine what it means to fight for justice. Before the dynamic duo became legend, before the second shadow joined the first, there existed a solitary warrior drowning in his own crusade. What you are about to hear is the complete chronicle of Batman and Robin, a saga where a broken man and a shattered boy found salvation in each other. Gotham City existed as a monument to human decay, a sprawling urban nightmare where the wealthy built towers that pierced the clouds while the forgotten masses suffered in streets that never saw sunlight. The city had a pulse, a rhythm of sirens and screams that played every night like a symphony of despair. Neon signs flickered across rain-soaked alleyways, casting shadows that seemed to move with predatory intent. This was a place where hope came to die, where good men either fled or became monsters themselves. The police force had long since surrendered to corruption, their badges mere decorations on the chests of criminals wearing uniforms. Politicians spoke of reform while counting money stained with innocent blood. Crime families ruled entire districts, their territories marked not by borders on maps, but by the bodies left as warnings in public squares. In the heart of this diseased metropolis, in the gleaming towers of the financial district, lived Bruce Wayne, a man whose wealth could not purchase the one thing he desperately needed. To the world, he appeared as nothing more than a privileged playboy, a billionaire who threw elaborate parties and dated supermodels while his city burned around him. They saw the champagne and the expensive suits, the charitable donations and the careless smile. What they could not see was the war raging inside him, the screams of his murdered parents that echoed through his mind every waking moment. What they could not know was that every night, when Gotham surrendered to its darkest impulses, Bruce Wayne died and something else emerged from the shadows. The Batman had walked these streets for years, a phantom that criminals whispered about in terrified voices. He moved through the darkness like smoke given form, appearing from nowhere to dispense brutal justice, before vanishing as mysteriously as he arrived. His methods were efficient and merciless, stopping just short of killing but leaving criminals broken in body and spirit. He had become exactly what he intended, a living nightmare that haunted the guilty, a symbol of fear that made even the most hardened gangsters hesitate before pulling a trigger. Yet, for all his victories, for all the lives he saved and criminals he put behind bars, Bruce Wayne remained utterly alone. The isolation was not merely physical, but existential, a loneliness that ate at him from within, like acid, dissolving his humanity piece by piece. He trusted no one completely, not even Alfred Pennyworth, the faithful butler who had raised him after his parents died. Every relationship in his life was built on lies and carefully constructed facades. He could not tell anyone who he truly was, could not share the weight he carried, could not admit that sometimes he stood on rooftops and wondered if throwing himself off would finally bring peace. The mission consumed everything, leaving no room for friendship or love or any connection that might make him vulnerable. He had convinced himself this was necessary, that isolation was the price of his crusade, that he alone could bear Gotham's burden. But what Bruce Wayne did not yet understand was that some weights are too heavy for one person to carry, that some darkness is too deep for a single light to penetrate. He did not know that salvation would come not from his own strength, but from the moment he chose to extend his hand to another lost soul. He could not imagine that his greatest weapon would not be fear, or gadgets, or martial arts mastery, but the simple act of not fighting alone. The change was coming, approaching like a storm on the horizon, and it would arrive wrapped in tragedy and soaked in blood. Somewhere across the city, in a circus tent filled with laughter and wonder, a young boy was about to have his entire world destroyed. His name was Dick Grayson, and he performed with his family as the Flying Graysons, acrobats whose grace and skill seemed to defy the laws of physics. He knew nothing of Batman or Bruce Wayne, nothing of the darkness that awaited him, nothing of the destiny that would bind him to a stranger dressed as a creature of the night. In those final moments of innocence, as he prepared for the performance that would change everything, Dick Grayson was simply a happy child living a beautiful life. But Gotham City had a way of taking beautiful things and crushing them into dust, and this night would be no exception. The threads of fate were already weaving together, drawing these two souls toward a collision that would create something the world had never seen before. In the space between one heartbeat and the next, between one breath and the last, the legend of the dynamic duo was about to be born from the ashes of unspeakable loss. The story of Bruce Wayne began not with a choice, but with a moment of absolute helplessness. A single night that shattered his childhood and set him on a path from which there could be no return. Thomas and Martha Wayne had taken their young son to the Monarch Theater to watch a film, a rare evening where Gotham's most prominent family tried to pretend they were just like everyone else. The movie had frightened young Bruce with its imagery of bats swooping through darkness, and he had asked his parents if they could leave early. They agreed without hesitation, because they loved him, because they wanted him to feel safe, because they could not know that this simple act of parenting would lead them into the mouth of death itself. Crime Alley earned its name, honestly. A narrow passage between buildings where the city's filth seemed to concentrate, where broken streetlights created pockets of shadow, perfect for predators to hide. The Wayne family had barely taken a dozen steps into that alley when a figure emerged from the darkness, a man with desperate eyes and a gun that trembled in his shaking hands. He demanded their valuables with a voice cracking from drug withdrawal, and Thomas Wayne complied immediately, reaching for his wallet to give this stranger whatever he wanted. But Martha Wayne wore a pearl necklace, a string of luminous white beads that caught what little light existed in that forsaken place, and when the gunman reached for it, she instinctively pulled back. The sound of the first gunshot seemed to freeze time itself, a thunderclap of violence that echoed off brick walls and concrete. Thomas Wayne fell backward, his expensive suit blooming red across the chest, his eyes wide with the knowledge that he was dying and could do nothing to protect his family. Martha Wayne screamed and lunged for her husband, and the second shot cut that scream short, dropping her beside him as her pearl necklace shattered, sending dozens of white beads bouncing and rolling across the filthy ground like fallen stars. Young Bruce stood paralyzed, his mind unable to process what his eyes were seeing, his parents' blood spreading in dark pools that reflected the distant lights of the uncaring city above. The gunman ran, disappearing back into the shadows from which he had emerged, leaving behind a scene of such profound tragedy that it would echo through decades. Bruce Wayne dropped to his knees between his dying parents, their blood soaking into his clothes, their final breaths rattling in their throats. As they tried to speak words they would never finish, his mother's hand reached for him, with fingers already growing cold, and his father's lips moved in what might have been an attempt to say, "Everything would be all right." But death stole those words before they could offer any comfort. The boy who had been Bruce Wayne died in that alley alongside his parents, and what remained was something raw and broken and burning with a rage that would never be extinguished. The years that followed transformed grief into purpose, channeling his fury into something focused and sharp. Bruce Wayne disappeared from Gotham at 18, telling the few people who cared that he needed to find himself, to travel and heal from his childhood trauma. What he actually did was hunt down every master of combat, every teacher of deception, every expert in forensics and criminology he could find across the entire world. He trained with martial artists in hidden monasteries where students were beaten bloody to teach them endurance. He studied with detective agencies that operated in the shadows of European capitals, learning to read crime scenes like books written in blood and violence. He apprenticed with stage magicians and escape artists, understanding that theatricality and misdirection were as valuable as any weapon. In the mountains of the East, he learned to ignore pain, to push his body beyond what normal humans considered possible, to make his flesh into armor and his bones into iron. In the jungles of South America, he studied with trackers who could follow day-old trails through dense vegetation, who could move through forest without disturbing a single leaf. In the deserts of the Middle East, he trained with interrogators who understood the architecture of the human mind, who knew precisely which pressure points would break a person's will without ever touching their body. Each teacher gave him a piece of the puzzle, a skill that would later combine with all the others to create something unprecedented. But technique alone was not enough, and Bruce Wayne understood this on a fundamental level. Criminals were a cowardly and superstitious lot, as his father had once told him during a dinner conversation that now felt like it had happened in another lifetime. If he was going to wage war on crime itself, if he was going to strike terror into hearts that felt no remorse, he needed more than skill and determination. He needed to become fear incarnate, to transform himself into a symbol that would haunt the guilty long after he had vanished into the night. The question consumed him during his final year abroad, a puzzle more complex than any martial arts technique or detective methodology. The answer came to him during a meditation session in a monastery, perched on a cliff face in Tibet, where monks practiced their forms in courtyards open to the sky. A bat had flown through the training hall, its wings spreading wide as it swooped through the space, and every person in that room had instinctively flinched, had felt that primal spark of fear that such creatures triggered in human hearts. Bruce Wayne watched that bat disappear through an open window and felt something click into place in his mind. Bats emerged from darkness, operated in the hours when humans felt most vulnerable, inspired revulsion and terror in equal measure. They were creatures of nightmare, and that was precisely what Gotham needed. He returned to Gotham City at 25, a man forged in disciplines from around the world, carrying knowledge that most people could not acquire in 10 lifetimes. Wayne Manor rose on the outskirts of the city, a Gothic structure that had housed his family for generations, now maintained by Alfred Pennyworth, the only person who had remained loyal through Bruce's long absence. The estate sat atop a natural cave system, limestone formations carved by underground rivers over millions of years, creating chambers and passages that stretched for miles beneath the property. When Bruce descended into those caves for the first time since his return, when he stood in that enormous central cavern and heard the flutter of wings from the thousands of bats that nested in the darkness above, he knew he had found his headquarters. The transformation of those caves into the Batcave consumed months of secretive construction. He installed computer systems that could interface with every database in the city, surveillance equipment that would allow him to monitor Gotham's pulse in real time, and training facilities that would keep his body at peak condition. He designed vehicles that could navigate both streets and rooftops, gadgets that would give him advantages against enemies who might outnumber or outgun him. And most importantly, he created the suit. The Batman costume was not merely clothing but psychological warfare made tangible, every element chosen to maximize fear and intimidate his enemies. The cowl with pointed ears that suggested something animalistic, the cape that would spread behind him like wings, the dark armor that absorbed light and made him appear as nothing more than a living shadow. The first night he donned that costume and emerged onto Gotham streets, Bruce Wayne felt something inside him settle into place, as if he had finally discovered his true form. He was no longer pretending to be something he was not, no longer hiding behind the mask of a careless playboy. This was who he had always been meant to become, and the city would learn to fear the name Batman. 3 men were beating a woman in an alley off Dixon Street, their laughter echoing off graffiti-covered walls as they took turns kicking her curled form. They did not hear Batman approach because he made no sound, moving across rooftops before dropping into the alley behind them like a predator descending on prey. When the first attacker turned and saw that dark figure standing there, cape spreading wide and eyes glowing white from the lenses in the cowl, he made a sound that was not quite human, a whimper of pure animal terror. Batman moved through them like a force of nature, every strike precise and devastating, breaking bones and rupturing organs with the efficiency of someone who had studied human anatomy and knew exactly where to hit for maximum damage. The entire fight lasted less than 30 seconds, and when it was over, 3 criminals lay unconscious in their own blood, while the woman they had been attacking stared up at her savior with eyes wide with shock. Batman checked that she was breathing, that her injuries were not life-threatening, and then he grappled to the nearest rooftop and disappeared before police sirens could arrive. He left no evidence of his presence, except the testimony of witnesses who would claim they had seen a demon, a creature of shadow and violence that had appeared from nowhere and vanished just as mysteriously. The legend of the Batman had begun, and Gotham City would never be the same. The first year of Batman's crusade established him as something between myth and reality, a story that criminals told each other in hushed voices while looking over their shoulders into dark corners. He dismantled mob operations by targeting their infrastructure, destroying drug shipments and burning money-counting houses, hitting them not with the law, but with direct action that bypassed corrupt police and judges. He developed a network of informants, people he had saved, or criminals he had terrified into cooperation, creating eyes and ears throughout the city that fed him information about upcoming crimes and power struggles within the underworld. Carmine Falcone, the Roman, controlled Gotham's organized crime with an iron fist, his influence extending into every profitable illegal enterprise, from drug trafficking to contract killing. He initially dismissed Batman as a nuisance, some vigilante who would be killed or captured within weeks of his first appearance. But as months passed and Batman continued to disrupt operations, continued to cost the Falcone family millions of dollars and dozens of soldiers, the Roman began to take this threat seriously. He put out contracts on Batman's head, offering increasingly large sums to anyone who could kill this creature that haunted his empire. None of the assassins or bounty hunters who came for that money survived their encounters with Batman. Some ended up in hospitals with injuries that would take months to heal. Others found themselves hanging upside down from bridges or buildings, wrapped in cables and left for the police to collect like packages. Batman was always 3 steps ahead, anticipating ambushes and turning them against his attackers, using their own tactics and weapons to dismantle their attempts on his life. Each failed assassination attempt only added to his legend, transforming him from a curious mystery into something that felt unstoppable. But the true shift in Gotham's criminal landscape came not from mob bosses or hired killers, but from a new breed of villain that emerged in response to Batman's presence. It was as if his existence had created a vacuum that drew madness to fill it, attracting broken minds that saw in this vigilante either a challenge to overcome or a kindred spirit to engage. The first of these was a man who called himself the Joker, and his arrival in Gotham marked the beginning of an era where crime became something far more terrifying than simple theft or murder. The Joker announced himself by poisoning an entire city block with a gas that caused uncontrollable laughter, followed by painful death. victims dying with grotesque smiles frozen on their faces. He left no demands, no explanation for his actions, only a calling card with a crude drawing of a grinning face. Batman spent 3 days tracking him through the city's underbelly, following a trail of chaos and bodies until he finally cornered the madman in an abandoned amusement park on the waterfront. What he found was not a criminal but a force of pure anarchic destruction, a man with a white face and green hair who seemed to exist only to prove that the world was one enormous joke. Their first battle nearly killed Batman. Not because the Joker was physically superior, but because he fought without any regard for his own survival. He used Joker venom and explosives and improvised weapons with the creativity of someone completely unbound by sanity or self-preservation instinct. Batman managed to subdue him, barely, and delivered him to Arkham Asylum, the psychiatric facility that housed Gotham's most dangerous mentally ill criminals. But even as Batman watched police lock the Joker away, he felt a creeping certainty that this was not over. That this particular enemy would return again and again, that he had found an adversary who would haunt him for the rest of his life. Harvey Dent represented a different kind of tragedy, the fall of Gotham's White Knight into darkness. He had been the city's district attorney, a man of principle who worked alongside Batman and Commissioner James Gordon to bring down corrupt officials and mob bosses through legitimate legal channels. The three of them formed an unofficial alliance, a triumvirate dedicated to saving Gotham through different but complementary means. Harvey Dent was everything Bruce Wayne pretended to be during daylight hours, a symbol of hope and justice working within the system, and Batman respected him more than almost anyone else in the city. The transformation happened during a court trial when Sal Maroni, a mob boss facing life imprisonment, threw acid in Harvey Dent's face. The left side of his face was destroyed, flesh melted and scarred beyond recognition, and something inside his mind broke along with his flesh. He became Two-Face, a villain obsessed with duality and chance, making all his decisions based on the flip of a coin that had been scarred on one side to match his ruined face. Batman fought him through burning buildings and across rooftops, trying to reach the man he had once considered a friend, but Harvey Dent was gone, consumed by the monster the acid had created. The Riddler emerged next, a former forensic accountant named Edward Nygma, whose brilliance had been ignored and dismissed by employers and colleagues. He turned his analytical mind toward crime, leaving elaborate puzzles and riddles at crime scenes, challenging Batman to catch him while simultaneously proving his own intellectual superiority. Each crime became a game, each riddle a test, and Batman found himself spending hours decoding messages and solving brain teasers while racing against deadlines to stop bombs or rescue hostages. The Riddler wanted to prove he was smarter than the Dark Knight, wanted recognition and acknowledgement of his genius, and Batman gave him neither, solving every puzzle and stopping every scheme with a grim determination that infuriated the villain. Catwoman presented a different kind of challenge altogether, neither pure villain nor hero, but something that existed in the gray spaces between. Selina Kyle was a master thief who stole from the wealthy and corrupt, and while Batman opposed her crimes on principle, he could not deny a grudging respect for her skills and the fact that she rarely hurt anyone during her heists. Their encounters became a dance of sorts, a game of cat and mouse where the boundaries between adversary and ally remained frustratingly unclear. She challenged Batman in ways the others could not, making him question the rigid morality that defined his crusade, suggesting through word and deed that the world was not as black and white as he wanted to believe. Commissioner James Gordon stood as the only truly honest cop in a police force, rotten with corruption, a man who refused bribes and refused to look away when his fellow officers broke the laws they were sworn to uphold. He was older than Batman, gray-haired and tired, carrying the weight of decades spent fighting a losing battle against institutional decay. When Batman first approached him on the roof of Gotham Central, Gordon had drawn his gun with shaking hands, unsure whether he was facing a vigilante or another criminal in costume. But Batman had proven himself through actions rather than words, feeding Gordon information about corrupt cops and providing evidence that led to dozens of arrests and convictions. Their partnership was built on mutual necessity and hard-earned trust. Gordon needed someone who could operate outside the law to gather evidence and stop crimes that would otherwise go unpunished due to police corruption. Batman needed someone inside the system who could legitimize his efforts, who could ensure that the criminals he caught actually faced consequences rather than being released by bought judges. They met on rooftops and in shadowed alleys, sharing information and coordinating efforts. Two very different men, united by their dedication to a city that seemed determined to destroy itself. But for all his victories, for all the criminals he put away and lives he saved, Batman remained fundamentally alone. He returned each night to Wayne Manor, peeling off his costume in the Batcave and emerging as Bruce Wayne, billionaire playboy who smiled at parties while feeling nothing inside. Alfred Pennyworth saw through the facade because he had raised Bruce from childhood, understood the depth of trauma that drove this crusade, and worried constantly that one night Batman would not come home. The butler maintained the cave, patched Batman's wounds, and offered counsel that Bruce rarely took, playing the role of father figure to a man who had never properly grieved the loss of his actual father. The isolation was not merely circumstantial, but self-imposed, a wall Batman built around himself brick by brick. He could not afford relationships, because relationships created vulnerabilities, could not allow himself to love, because love gave enemies leverage, could not even maintain friendships, because every person in his life became a potential target. He had convinced himself that this loneliness was strength, that needing no one meant no one could be used against him, that the mission required him to sacrifice any chance at human connection. He was wrong, but he would not realize this until tragedy forced his hand. Bruce Wayne stood on a gargoyle at the edge of a skyscraper, cape whipping in the wind, looking down at a city that never stopped bleeding. Sirens wailed in the distance, police responding to crimes he could not prevent, because he was only one man. Somewhere in those streets, people were being hurt, killed, and destroyed by a criminal element that reproduced faster than he could cut it down. He had been fighting this war for years, and Gotham was no better for his efforts. If anything, the villains were becoming more dangerous, more theatrical, more willing to kill innocent people just to get Batman's attention. The weight of it all pressed down on his shoulders, like physical mass, threatening to crush him under the accumulated burden of every life he could not save, every crime he could not prevent, every moment he was 1 second too late. He did not sleep more than a few hours each night, his body sustained by Alfred's medical care and sheer force of will. His back and knees ached from old injuries that had never properly healed. His hands were covered in scars from punching faces and breaking bones. Sometimes he looked in the mirror and barely recognized the man staring back at him, seeing only a weapon honed to a single purpose, a machine running on rage and guilt. Batman did not know that everything was about to change. He did not know that fate was already in motion, that across the city a circus was setting up for a performance that would end in tragedy. He did not know that he was about to meet someone who would force him to confront his isolation, who would prove that some burdens are meant to be shared, who would become not just a partner but family. The legend of the dynamic duo had not yet been written, but the first page was about to turn, and nothing would ever be the same again. The night that changed everything began with laughter and wonder, two commodities that had no place in Gotham City, yet somehow survived within the red and white striped tent of Halley's Circus. The traveling show had arrived on the outskirts of town, setting up in an empty lot near the docks where the smell of salt water mixed with diesel fuel and rotting fish. Families from across the city gathered under that big top, desperate for a few hours of escape from the grinding reality of their lives, seeking magic in a world that offered only cruelty. The ringmaster promised them spectacles and marvels, death-defying acts performed by the most talented performers in the world, and for once, Gotham allowed itself to believe. The Flying Graysons were the main attraction. A family of acrobats whose grace and skill seemed to transcend human limitation. John Grayson and his wife Mary had been performing together since they were teenagers, their bodies moving in perfect synchronization as they flew through the air with a trust that only comes from years of shared danger. Their son Dick had joined the act when he was barely old enough to walk, and now at 12 years old, he moved across the high wire and trapeze with the confidence of someone who had never known fear. The three of them wore costumes of green and gold that caught the spotlight, their bodies twisting and spinning through space while the audience gasped and applauded below. Dick Grayson loved performing more than anything else in his young life. Loved the rush of adrenaline as he released the trapeze bar and sailed through empty air. Loved the feeling of his father's strong hands catching him with perfect timing. Loved the roar of the crowd when they completed a particularly difficult sequence. His parents had taught him that circus people were a family bound not by blood alone, but by shared danger and absolute trust. Every person in that traveling show looked out for each other, protected each other, formed a community that moved from city to city, carrying their own small island of joy. Dick had never lived in one place for more than a few weeks, never attended a normal school or made friends outside the circus, and he had never wanted any of those things because he had everything he needed right here. Bruce Wayne sat in the audience that night, brought there by a charitable obligation he could barely remember agreeing to. Wayne Enterprises had donated money to sponsor the circus, and someone on his staff had insisted he make an appearance to maintain his playboy philanthropist image. He sat in a private box with several other wealthy donors, forcing smiles and making small talk, while his mind remained focused on the case he was working, a series of warehouse robberies that showed signs of Penguin's involvement. He barely watched the first few acts. Clowns and jugglers, and trained animals that held no interest for a man who spent his nights fighting monsters. But when the Flying Graysons took the stage, even Bruce Wayne found himself paying attention. There was something about the way they moved, a beauty and precision that reminded him of his own training, of the countless hours he had spent perfecting his body's capabilities. He watched the young boy perform flips and catches that would kill most trained athletes, watched the absolute trust between parents and child, and felt something twist inside his chest. This was what family looked like, what love looked like, what he had lost in that alley so many years ago. Tony Zuko sat in the cheap seats, his eyes fixed not on the performers, but on the rigging above them. He was a low-level enforcer for one of Gotham's smaller crime families, a man whose primary skills involved intimidation and violence, now tasked with sending a message to Mr. Haley for refusing to pay protection money. The circus owner had made the mistake of thinking his show was exempt from Gotham's rules, had believed that because they only stayed in town for a week, they could avoid getting entangled with the local criminal element. Zuko had been sent to correct this misunderstanding in a way that would ensure no other traveling show made the same error. He had climbed into the rigging earlier that day, and the tent was empty and the performers were having lunch, and he had methodically weakened the bolts holding the trapeze platform in place. The work had taken less than 15 minutes, and when he was done, the platform looked completely secure while being one good impact away from catastrophic failure. Zuko felt no guilt about what he was about to do. no concern for whoever might die as a result of his sabotage. This was business, and in Gotham, business was written in blood. The Flying Graysons reached the climax of their act, the moment where all three would perform their famous triple somersault. A trick so dangerous that most insurance companies refused to cover performers who attempted it. Dick launched himself from the platform with all his strength, spinning through the air once, twice, 3 times, while the audience held its collective breath. His parents reached for him from their own trapeze, hands extending to catch their son with the timing they had perfected through thousands of performances. Dick's fingers touched his father's wrists, began to close around them, and then the world exploded into chaos and screaming. The platform his parents were anchored to gave way with a sound like a gunshot, bolts shearing free and sending the entire structure plummeting toward the ground. John and Mary Grayson fell, still holding each other, still reaching for their son, their faces showing not fear but a desperate need to make sure Dick was safe. They dropped 70 feet into the sawdust floor of the circus ring, hitting with impacts that made sounds no human being should ever have to hear. Blood spread across the ground in dark pools, and the festive atmosphere shattered like glass, replaced by screams and panicked movement as the audience tried to process what they had just witnessed. Dick hung from his trapeze, arms wrapped around the bar, staring down at his parents' broken bodies with a mind that refused to accept what his eyes were showing him. He made a sound that started as his mother's name and became a wail of pure anguish, a cry that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than his lungs, from his very soul tearing itself apart. He tried to climb down, moving on autopilot, his trained body carrying him to the ground, while his consciousness remained frozen in the moment before the fall. When his feet touched sawdust soaked with his parents' blood, when he ran to their bodies and tried to shake them awake, his screams became words, begging them to get up, to stop playing this terrible joke, to please, please, please not leave him alone. Bruce Wayne was already moving, pushing through the panicked crowd with the efficiency of someone trained to respond to crisis. He reached the circus ring just as police officers were arriving, just as someone was trying to pull Dick away from his parents' bodies, and he saw in that boy's face a mirror of his own past. The same devastation, the same incomprehension, the same moment where childhood ends and something darker begins. Dick's eyes met his across the chaos, and in that instant, Bruce Wayne recognized a fundamental truth. This boy was about to be consumed by the same darkness that had swallowed Bruce decades ago, unless someone intervened, unless someone who understood that specific flavor of trauma reached out a hand. The police took statements from witnesses and circus personnel, their questions mechanical and useless. Mr. Haley explained about Tony Zuko demanding protection money, about the threats that had been made when he refused to pay, and suddenly this was not an accident, but murder. Dick sat wrapped in a blanket, no longer crying because his body had run out of tears, staring at nothing while Child Services representatives discussed where he would be placed. The system would swallow him, shuttle him through foster homes and institutions, and no one in that tent understood what such a system would do to a child carrying this specific weight of grief and rage. Bruce Wayne approached the lead detective, a tired man named Marcus, who had worked enough crime scenes to be numb to tragedy. He spoke quietly, but with absolute authority, using his name and wealth as weapons to cut through bureaucracy. Dick Grayson would not be going into the system, would not be sleeping in some group home tonight. Bruce Wayne was invoking his position on the board of multiple charitable organizations, was making calls to judges and social workers, was leveraging every connection and dollar he possessed to ensure this boy would be placed in his custody immediately. The detective tried to argue about proper procedure, about investigations and evaluations, but money and power spoke louder than protocol, and within 2 hours, Dick Grayson was sitting in the back of a limousine heading toward Wayne Manor. The boy had not spoken since leaving the circus, had not responded to any questions or attempts at comfort. He stared out the window at Gotham passing by, this city that had killed his parents, and Bruce saw the rage building behind those eyes. He recognized it because he had felt it himself, that burning need for vengeance, that certainty that someone must pay for this injustice. Alfred had prepared a guest room, but Dick barely looked at the comfortable bed and expensive furnishings. He was somewhere else, his mind replaying the fall over and over, searching for what he could have done differently, how he might have saved them. Days passed in a blur of funeral arrangements and legal proceedings. The flying Graysons were buried in a Gotham cemetery, far from any city they had ever called home, because Dick had no other family to claim their bodies. He stood at the graveside in an ill-fitting black suit Bruce had purchased, watching workers lower his parents into the ground, and something inside him hardened into diamond. He would find Tony Zuko. He would make him pay. The specifics of how did not matter, only the certainty that the man who killed his family would suffer. Bruce Wayne watched the boy and remembered his own similar vows, remembered the years of rage that had driven him across the world and eventually into a cave beneath his home. He had spent decades perfecting his revenge, channeling his fury into something focused and effective, and he could see Dick about to embark on the same dark journey. The question that kept Bruce awake at night was whether he should stop the boy or help him, whether it was more cruel to let Dick stumble blindly toward vengeance or to teach him how to achieve it properly. Dick Grayson lived at Wayne Manor like a ghost, moving through rooms without seeing them, eating meals without tasting them, going through motions of existence while feeling nothing but the absence where his parents had been. He attended the private school Bruce enrolled him in, but learned nothing, stared at blackboards and textbooks, while his mind planned how to escape, how to find Zuko, how to hurt him in ways that matched the hurt Dick felt. The other students gave him wide berth, sensing something dangerous in this quiet boy with eyes that held too much pain for someone so young. At night, Dick would wake from nightmares that replayed the fall in vivid detail, sometimes seeing his parents catch him and then dropping him, sometimes seeing himself falling instead of them, always ending with that terrible sound of impact. He would sit at his window looking out at Gotham's lights, remembering his mother's laugh and his father's strong hands, feeling the hole in his chest where his family used to live. The manor was too big, too quiet, too full of expensive things that meant nothing to a boy who had lived in a circus trailer and been happier than he would ever be again. Bruce tried to reach him through conventional means, offering to talk about his feelings, suggesting therapy or support groups for children who had lost parents. Dick refused everything with a polite coldness that was somehow more concerning than outright rebellion. He was planning something. Bruce could see it in the way the boy asked casual questions about the city, about how one might find a specific person, about whether the police were competent at solving crimes. Alfred reported finding maps of Gotham in Dick's room, certain neighborhoods circled, notes written in margins about gang territories and protection rackets. The breaking point came 3 weeks after the funeral, when Dick simply disappeared from the manor in the middle of the night. Bruce had been in the Batcave monitoring police frequencies when Alfred informed him the boy's room was empty and the security system showed him leaving through a window. Dick was 12 years old, alone in Gotham at night, hunting a killer with nothing but rage and ignorance. He would be dead before morning unless someone stopped him, and Bruce Wayne knew with absolute certainty that he could not let another child die in this city's darkness. That man found Dick Grayson in the Bowery, already in trouble, surrounded by 3 gang members who had caught him asking questions about Tony Zuko in the wrong neighborhood. The boy was holding a piece of rebar like a weapon, his circus training giving him balance and reflexes but not the skill to fight multiple opponents. One of the gang members had a knife, another a gun, and they were taking their time with this stupid kid who had wandered into their territory making threats. Batman dropped into the middle of the confrontation like divine intervention, and the gang members scattered before his first punch landed, running into the night and leaving Dick standing alone with Gotham's most feared vigilante. Dick stared at Batman with recognition, but no fear. This legend he had heard whispered about, this creature that criminals claimed was not even human. He did not lower his makeshift weapon, did not step back, only asked in a voice rough from disuse whether Batman knew where to find Tony Zuko. The Dark Knight looked at this child, this boy wearing clothes too expensive for the Bowery, holding a piece of metal like it could protect him from the city that had murdered his parents, and made a decision that would change both their lives forever. Batman told Dick the truth. Not the comfortable lies adults usually offered children. Tony Zuko was a killer who would murder Dick without hesitation if given the chance. The boy had no training, no skills beyond acrobatics, no understanding of the criminal underworld or how to navigate its dangers. If Dick continued on this path alone, he would die, and his parents' last living legacy would be erased from the world. The words were harsh, delivered in Batman's gravelly voice, designed to cut through rage and reach whatever rationality remained in the boy's mind. Dick listened, his knuckles white around the rebar, his jaw clenched so tight it must have hurt. When Batman finished, the boy asked a single question in a voice that carried the weight of absolute commitment. Would Batman teach him what he needed to know, train him to hunt monsters, help him become strong enough to make Zuko pay? It was not really a question but a demand, an ultimatum from someone with nothing left to lose. If Batman refused, Dick would continue alone, and probably die. If Batman agreed, he would be taking responsibility for forging a child into a weapon, repeating the cycle of trauma that had consumed his own life. Bruce Wayne thought about the loneliness that had defined his crusade, the isolation he had imposed on himself, believing it made him stronger. He thought about Harvey Dent's fall and the Joker's madness and all the darkness that had accumulated in his war against crime. He thought about what might have been different if someone had reached out to him after his parents died, if he had not walked this path completely alone. The decision should have been impossible, but somehow, it was the easiest choice Bruce Wayne had ever made. Batman removed his cowl, revealing Bruce Wayne's face to the boy he had taken into his home. He told Dick everything about Crime Alley and the gunmen and the years of training across the world. He explained what it meant to be Batman, the mission and the code, and the never-ending war against criminals who would keep coming, no matter how many were stopped. He offered Dick a choice, the same choice that had been made for him by tragedy and rage. They could work together to find justice for both their families, could transform Dick's grief into purpose, could forge something new from the broken pieces of their shattered lives. But it would require years of training, absolute dedication, and the acceptance that once this path was chosen, there could be no going back to normal childhood. Dick Grayson stood in that alley, looking at the face of Gotham's greatest hero, understanding that this moment would define the rest of his existence. He could return to Wayne Manor, eventually process his grief, grow up to be whoever Dick Grayson might have become if his parents had never fallen. Or he could accept Bruce Wayne's offer, could dive into darkness and violence, could become something more than human and less than whole. The choice should have been impossible for a 12-year-old boy, but somehow, it was the easiest decision Dick Grayson would ever make. He dropped the rebar, its clang against concrete echoing in the empty street, and extended his hand to shake Bruce Wayne's. The deal was made without need for further words, a pact sealed in the shadows of the city that had destroyed them both. Batman put his cowl back on and told Dick to follow him. and together they vanished into Gotham's darkness, heading toward a cave beneath a manor where a legend would be forged from trauma and determination. The dynamic duo did not exist yet, but its foundation had been laid, and nothing would ever be the same for either of them. Alfred Pennyworth watched them descend into the Batcave, the master he had raised, and the boy who had lost everything, and felt his heart break with understanding of what was about to happen. He had spent years trying to pull Bruce back from the abyss, trying to preserve some humanity in the man who wore the cowl, and he had failed. Now Bruce was about to take a child down that same dark path, and Alfred could only pray that somehow, impossibly, they might save each other from the darkness instead of drowning in it together. The old butler descended the stairs behind them, preparing to do what he had always done, to support and protect even when he disagreed, because family meant bearing witness to choices you could not prevent. Dick Grayson stood in the Batcave, a vast underground chamber lit by computer screens and filled with equipment whose purpose he could only guess at. Bats flew overhead, their wings creating wind that stirred his hair, and he felt something inside him shift and settle. This place felt right in a way Wayne Manor never had, this darkness and stone and sense of purpose. He looked at Bruce Wayne, at Batman, and asked when they would begin. The answer was immediate and absolute. They would begin tonight, and they would not stop until Dick was ready, no matter how many years that required. The training that followed would have broken most adults, let alone a grieving 12-year-old boy. But Dick Grayson proved to be unlike anyone Bruce Wayne had ever encountered. His circus background gave him a foundation of flexibility and body awareness that normally took years to develop. His rage gave him motivation that never wavered, even when his body screamed for rest and his muscles tore from overuse. Most importantly, his natural optimism, buried but not destroyed by tragedy, allowed him to see possibility where Bruce only saw obstacles. He was not trying to become Batman, was not interested in replacing or copying his mentor. Dick was becoming something new, something that would complement Bruce's darkness rather than mirror it. Bruce taught him everything, holding nothing back. Martial arts from a dozen disciplines, detective work and forensics, criminology and psychology, how to read body language and detect lies, how to move through shadows and use fear as a weapon. They spent hours in the cave's training area, Dick learning to transform his acrobatic grace into combat efficiency, his circus tricks into tactical advantages. Bruce showed him scars and explained the lessons each one had taught, shared mistakes and near-death experiences, gave Dick the benefit of decades of painful education compressed into intensive study. But Dick brought his own gifts to the partnership, perspectives Bruce had never considered. He saw patterns Bruce missed, approached problems from angles Bruce's linear thinking could not reach, suggested solutions that sounded crazy until they worked perfectly. Where Bruce was darkness and intimidation, Dick was light and hope, able to connect with victims and witnesses in ways Batman never could. The boy had a gift for reading people emotionally rather than analytically, for understanding what someone needed to hear rather than what logic dictated he should say. Alfred watched the transformation with mixed emotions, proud of Dick's dedication and progress, terrified of what they were creating. The boy trained until he collapsed, pushed himself beyond exhaustion every single day, and Alfred would find him asleep in the cave more often than in his bedroom. Dick ate like he was starving, his growing body demanding fuel for the punishment he inflicted on it, and Alfred made sure nutrition kept pace with destruction. The butler became medic and confidant, patching injuries and offering wisdom, trying to preserve some humanity in both Bruce and Dick even as they devoted themselves to becoming weapons. Years passed in the cave beneath Wayne Manor, Dick growing from 12 to 13 to 14. His body transforming from boyish to athletic, his skills developing from raw potential into refined capability. He attended school as required by law but learned nothing there. He valued his real education happening in darkness, surrounded by bats and computer screens. Bruce enrolled him in Wayne Enterprises' youth programs to maintain appearances, made sure he was seen at appropriate charitable functions, created the illusion of normal wealthy kid life, while Dick's reality was sweat and pain, an endless repetition of techniques. On Dick's 14th birthday, Bruce gave him a gift that had taken months to prepare. They stood in the Batcave's workshop, surrounded by tools and equipment, and Bruce presented a mannequin wearing a costume unlike anything Gotham had ever seen. Where Batman's suit was black and intimidating, this one was vibrant with colors, green and red and yellow, forming a design that seemed to capture light rather than absorb it. The tunic and cape suggested a bird in flight, and the overall effect was of youth and hope and fearlessness. Bruce explained that if Dick was going to fight beside him, he needed his own identity, his own symbol that reflected who he was, rather than trying to imitate what Batman represented. Dick stared at the costume, running his fingers over the fabric, and asked about the name. Bruce had considered many options, but it was Alfred who had suggested Robin, remembering an offhand comment Dick had made about his mother calling him that. The name fit perfectly, a small bright bird that sang even in darkness, a creature that represented spring and renewal. Dick tried on the costume, and when he looked at himself in the mirror, he saw not a child playing dress-up, but a warrior ready for battle. This was who he had been becoming, and now he had a form to match his purpose. Their first patrol together was scheduled for the following night, and neither of them slept in the hours leading up to it. Bruce ran through contingency plans obsessively, preparing for every possible danger, terrified that he was about to get Dick killed. Dick ran through his training in his mind, reviewing techniques and strategies, excited and nervous in equal measure. Alfred prepared medical supplies and made them both promise to be careful, knowing the promise meant nothing but needing to hear it anyway. When night fell, and they stood on a rooftop overlooking Gotham, Batman and Robin together, for the first time, something fundamental shifted in the city's balance. Bruce felt the change immediately. The way Dick's presence altered his approach, forcing him to communicate and plan instead of simply reacting with violence. Dick felt the rush of purpose, of finally taking action against the darkness that had consumed his parents, of becoming part of something larger than his own revenge. They moved across rooftops with Dick's acrobatic style complementing Bruce's economical efficiency, two different approaches to the same goal, creating something more effective than either could achieve alone. Their first stop was a robbery in progress. 3 armed men hitting a convenience store in the Narrows. Batman took position at the front entrance while Robin went through the back, and they moved simultaneously with coordination that felt natural, despite being their first real operation together. The criminals never had a chance, caught between Batman's overwhelming force and Robin's speed and agility, disarmed and subdued before they could properly react. The store owner stared at Robin with wide eyes, having heard of Batman but never imagining there might be a partner, especially not one who looked so young and moved like gravity was optional. Word spread through Gotham's underworld faster than wildfire. Whispered conversations in bars and hideouts about Batman having a sidekick, now a kid in bright colors who could do things that looked physically impossible. Some criminals laughed, thinking this Robin was a weakness to exploit, a target they could use as leverage against the Dark Knight. Those criminals learned very quickly how wrong they were, usually while Robin was using their own weapons against them or leaving them hanging upside down for police to collect. Dick was not a weakness, but a force multiplier, covering angles Batman could not reach, preventing escapes through routes Batman could not access, bringing energy and innovation to encounters that might otherwise have turned deadly. But more than tactical advantages, Robin changed Batman on a fundamental level. Bruce found himself explaining his reasoning aloud, teaching Dick not just what to do but why, and in that process, he rediscovered his own humanity. He laughed, for the first time in years, at one of Dick's jokes mid-patrol, felt pride watching the boy master a technique Bruce had spent months learning, experienced hope that maybe Gotham could be saved after all. Dick gave Bruce a reason to fight that extended beyond punishment and revenge, gave him someone to protect and mentor, reminded him why he had started this crusade in the first place. Dick, meanwhile, found in Bruce not just a teacher but a father figure, someone who understood his darkness without trying to fix it, who channeled his rage into purpose rather than suppressing it. Their relationship developed beyond mentor and student into something deeper, built on shared trauma and mutual respect and the unspoken understanding that they had saved each other. Dick would never have his birth parents back, and Bruce would never escape the guilt of his parents' murder. But together they created a new family forged in the fires of Gotham's endless night. They were the dynamic duo now, and the city would learn to fear them both. The years that followed the formation of the dynamic duo became the stuff of legend, a golden age where Batman and Robin seemed to be everywhere at once, dismantling criminal operations with a precision and efficiency that bordered on supernatural. They developed a rhythm that went beyond simple coordination, moving together like two parts of a single organism, anticipating each other's actions with an understanding that required no words. Bruce taught Dick to read situations the way he did, to see patterns in chaos and predict outcomes before they occurred, while Dick taught Bruce that sometimes intuition and improvisation worked better than meticulous planning. They became greater than the sum of their parts, a partnership that redefined what vigilante justice could accomplish in a city as broken as Gotham. The Maroney crime family fell first, their drug distribution network systematically destroyed over the course of 3 months. Batman and Robin hit them on multiple fronts simultaneously, with Robin infiltrating their counting houses through air vents and windows, while Batman confronted enforcers in the streets. They coordinated their strikes to create maximum chaos, making the Maroneys believe they were under attack from dozens of opponents, rather than just 2. Dick's ability to move silently through spaces Batman could never access proved invaluable, stealing ledgers and recording conversations that provided evidence of corruption reaching into the highest levels of city government. By the time the Maroneys realized what was happening, their empire had already collapsed, their soldiers arrested and their money seized. The Joker presented a different kind of challenge, one that tested the dynamic duo in ways neither had anticipated. The clown prince of crime became obsessed with Robin, fascinated by this bright spot of color and youth that dared to exist in Gotham's darkness. He orchestrated elaborate traps designed specifically to separate the partners, to force Robin into situations where his inexperience would get him killed, to prove to Batman that training a child for this life was the ultimate act of cruelty. One night, the Joker lured Robin to an abandoned amusement park using a fake distress call, and Dick walked into a funhouse filled with death traps and Joker venom while Batman raced across the city trying to reach him in time. Dick survived that night by using everything Bruce had taught him, staying calm while poisoned gas filled rooms, solving deadly puzzles while the Joker's laughter echoed from hidden speakers, fighting through hallucinations induced by fear toxin to find the exit. When Batman finally arrived, he found Robin standing over an unconscious Joker, the boy's costume torn and stained with blood, his body shaking from adrenaline and toxin exposure, but his eyes clear and focused. Bruce had never been more terrified or more proud, seeing that Dick had become capable of surviving encounters that would kill trained soldiers, yet knowing that every victory meant the next challenge would be even more dangerous. They sat together on the roof of the funhouse while police secured the scene below, neither speaking, both understanding that they had crossed a threshold from which there was no return. The Riddler's schemes became increasingly elaborate as he tried to outsmart the dynamic duo, creating puzzles within puzzles that required both Batman's analytical mind and Robin's creative thinking to solve. Edward Nygma would leave clues scattered across the city, each one leading to the next, building toward some grand finale that usually involved bombs or hostages or both. Dick approached these challenges like mental gymnastics, flipping perspectives and making connections that seemed illogical until they proved correct. He had a gift for seeing the answers Nygma wanted them to find, then looking past those to discover the real solution hidden beneath. Bruce learned to trust Dick's seemingly random insights, watching in amazement as the boy solved riddles in minutes that might have taken Batman hours. One particular case involved the Riddler threatening to blow up 5 locations across Gotham unless Batman could solve a series of impossible riddles within 6 hours. The clues seemed contradictory, referencing historical events and mathematical concepts in ways that made no logical sense. Bruce spent the first hour trying to find patterns using traditional analysis, growing increasingly frustrated as the countdown continued. Dick sat cross-legged on the Batcave floor, reading the riddles aloud in different voices, acting them out like characters in a play, approaching them not as logic problems but as stories. Suddenly he laughed and explained that the riddles were not meant to be solved individually but read together as a single narrative, telling the story of where Nygma was hiding. They found the Riddler in an old library scheduled for demolition, surrounded by books and looking genuinely impressed that someone had finally understood the elegance of his design. Two-Face brought a different kind of danger, his dual nature making him unpredictable in ways that even the Joker could not match. Harvey Dent's coin determined his actions, and half the time those actions involved helping people rather than hurting them, creating situations where Batman and Robin had to decide whether to fight someone who was currently acting as a vigilante himself. Dick struggled with Two-Face more than the other villains because he saw the tragedy clearly, understood that Harvey Dent had been a good man destroyed by circumstance, recognized that under different conditions he and Dick might have been friends. Bruce shared that pain, remembering the partnership they had once formed, mourning the loss of Gotham's White Knight to madness and disfigurement. The confrontation that nearly destroyed them all happened on a night when Two-Face had taken hostages in the courthouse, where he had once prosecuted criminals. His coin had decided their fate, and he was methodically executing the ones who landed on the scarred side, making speeches about justice and duality while their blood pooled on marble floors. Batman and Robin arrived to find chaos, hostages screaming, and Two-Face standing at the center with his gun raised toward a young prosecutor who reminded him of what he had once been. Robin moved without thinking, using a grappling line to swing across the courtroom and tackle the woman out of the line of fire, taking the bullet himself in the shoulder. Bruce felt his heart stop when he saw Dick fall, the boy's costume blooming red where the bullet had entered. Rage consumed him, a fury so pure and absolute that for a moment he forgot his code against killing. He moved toward Two-Face with murder in his eyes, hands reaching for the villain's throat, ready to snap his neck and end this once and for all. It was Robin's voice that stopped him, weak but steady, calling out Bruce's name and reminding him who they were, what they stood for, why they did not become the monsters they fought. Batman subdued Two-Face with restraint he did not feel, then rushed to Dick's side, applying pressure to the wound while sirens approached from outside. The bullet had missed anything vital, and Dick recovered within weeks. But something fundamental had shifted in their relationship. Bruce realized he had nearly broken his most important rule because someone had hurt his partner, nearly thrown away everything he believed because Dick was bleeding. The depth of his attachment terrified him, made him understand that loving someone meant giving them the power to destroy you. That caring for Dick made Bruce vulnerable in ways no physical weakness ever could. He tried to push Dick away after that, suggested maybe it was time for the boy to have a normal life, to go to college and pursue interests beyond vigilante justice. Dick refused with a stubbornness that matched Bruce's own, explaining that he had chosen this life knowing the risks, that he was not some fragile thing that needed protecting, that partnership meant trusting each other to survive. They argued in the Batcave with a passion that had been building for years, both saying things they did not mean, both terrified of losing the other, but expressing it through anger rather than honesty. Alfred watched from the stairs, ready to intervene if necessary, but ultimately they worked it out themselves, coming to understand that fear for each other was not weakness, but the price of love, that accepting that vulnerability made them stronger rather than weaker. Their relationship as surrogate father and son deepened through small moments between the action, Bruce teaching Dick to drive the Batmobile through obstacle courses in the cave, helping him with homework, even though Dick barely attended school anymore, having awkward conversations about girls and relationships that neither of them knew how to navigate properly. Dick dragged Bruce to normal activities when he could, insisting they attend a baseball game or eat at a diner, forcing the man who was Batman to remember how to be human occasionally. Alfred encouraged these moments, understanding that they needed balance, that being vigilantes every night would consume them if they did not maintain some connection to the ordinary world. Dick grew from 14 to 16 to 17, his body filling out with muscle, his voice deepening, his skills developing from impressive to genuinely masterful. He was no longer the kid who needed protecting, but a young man who could hold his own against opponents that would challenge Batman himself. He developed his own fighting style that blended acrobatics with martial arts, creating combinations that were beautiful and devastating in equal measure. Criminals learned to fear Robin as much as Batman, understanding that the bright costume did not signify weakness, but confidence, that anyone who moved like Robin did was far more dangerous than their youthful appearance suggested. The Justice League took notice of Batman's partner, and Dick found himself working alongside heroes he had only heard about in news reports. Superman treated him with respect rather than condescension, recognizing capability when he saw it. Wonder Woman offered to train him in Amazonian combat techniques during a team-up in Gateway City. The Flash raced him across rooftops for fun, impressed by how Dick's parkour skills let him keep pace with someone who could run at superhuman speeds. Dick thrived in these interactions, his natural charisma and optimism making him popular among heroes who found Batman too intense and brooding to work with comfortably. Bruce watched Dick grow into his own legend with complicated emotions, proud of everything the boy had accomplished, yet increasingly aware that Dick would eventually outgrow the Robin identity. He saw it in how other heroes looked to Dick for leadership during team missions, in how Dick questioned orders when he thought there were better approaches, in how the young man was developing a philosophy of heroism that diverged from Bruce's darker perspective. Robin believed in redemption and second chances in ways Batman struggled to embrace, saw good in people that Bruce only saw as potential threats, approached problems with hope where Bruce defaulted to suspicion. Their greatest test as partners came when the entire Rogues Gallery coordinated an attack on Gotham. Every major villain working together in an unprecedented alliance. The Joker provided chaotic energy, the Riddler strategic planning, Two-Face coordination through his dual nature, allowing him to see multiple perspectives, and Scarecrow's psychological warfare that turned the city's fear against itself. Penguin used his resources to fund the operation, while Poison Ivy and Mr. Freeze provided muscle and terror. It was the nightmare scenario Batman had always prepared for but never truly believed would happen. All his enemies setting aside their individual grudges to focus on destroying him and everything he protected. The city descended into chaos over the course of a single night, explosions rocking buildings across multiple districts, fear gas spreading through the subway system, Joker venom contaminating water supplies, plants overgrowing entire streets and trapping people in their homes. Police were overwhelmed within the first hour, and Commissioner Gordon put out a desperate call for Batman, knowing this was beyond what any official response could handle. Batman and Robin answered that call, but even they could not be everywhere at once, could not stop every attack or save every victim. They had to make impossible choices about which crises to address and which to leave to emergency services, knowing people would die no matter what they decided. Bruce sent Dick to handle the fear gas situation in the subway, because Robin's ability to move through confined spaces and his resistance to psychological manipulation made him the best choice for that mission. Batman himself went after the Joker, whose chaos was the linchpin holding the whole operation together. They split up, trusting each other to handle their assignments, fighting separate battles across a city that had become a war zone. Alfred coordinated from the Batcave, monitoring police frequencies and news reports, feeding them information about where they were needed most, watching helplessly as two people he loved put themselves in mortal danger. Dick found Scarecrow in the subway tunnels, surrounded by canisters releasing fear toxin into the ventilation system. The villain had expected Batman to come for him, had prepared psychological attacks tailored to Bruce's specific traumas, and seemed genuinely surprised when Robin appeared instead. They fought in darkness, broken only by emergency lights, Scarecrow's fear gas making Dick see visions of his parents falling endlessly while their son remained unable to catch them. But Dick had lived with that nightmare for years, had made peace with guilt and helplessness, and he pushed through the hallucinations with a determination that surprised even himself. He defeated Scarecrow, shut down the gas distribution, and then had to talk 36 terrified civilians through their own fear-induced panic, while waiting for hazmat teams to arrive. Batman tracked the Joker to Gotham Cathedral, a Gothic structure in the heart of the city, where the madman had set up what he called his masterpiece. The building was rigged with enough explosives to level 6 city blocks, and the Joker sat in the bell tower holding the detonator, his painted face split in a grin that promised death. He explained his philosophy while Batman approached carefully, talked about how tonight proved the fundamental chaos underlying all human civilization, how order was just a collective delusion that could shatter with the right pressure. Batman listened, buying time while analyzing the bomb setup, looking for ways to disarm it without triggering the dead man's switch he knew Joker must have installed. The confrontation turned physical when Batman realized he could not talk Joker down and could not disarm the bombs remotely. They fought across the bell tower, trading blows among massive bronze bells that rang with each impact, the sound deafening and disorienting. Joker was laughing the entire time, even as Batman broke his bones, finding joy in the violence and chaos. The detonator fell during their struggle, tumbling toward the ground far below, and both of them dove for it simultaneously. Batman caught it inches from the floor, his fingers closing around plastic and wires, his heart hammering as he realized one wrong move would kill thousands. Robin arrived just as Batman was manually disarming the cathedral bombs, having finished his own mission and tracked Bruce's location through the cowl's GPS. They worked together on the explosive devices, Dick's nimble fingers handling delicate wiring, while Bruce dealt with the main charges, both of them aware they were seconds from death if either made a mistake. The Joker watched from where Batman had left him unconscious, and when the last bomb was disarmed, when the detonator was safely powered down, Robin and Batman stood together looking out at Gotham's skyline, battered and bleeding but victorious. The cleanup took days, arresting villains and processing crime scenes, helping repair infrastructure, and providing statements to overwhelmed authorities. Batman and Robin were everywhere, working beyond exhaustion, refusing to stop until the crisis was fully contained. Commissioner Gordon shook their hands personally, his voice rough with emotion as he thanked them for saving his city. The citizens of Gotham painted murals of the dynamic duo on buildings across the city, spontaneous tributes to the heroes who had stood between them and annihilation. For a brief moment, Gotham believed in hope, believed that maybe good could triumph over evil, believed that Batman and Robin would always be there to protect them. But victory came with costs that went beyond physical injuries. Bruce looked at Dick during those days after the crisis, and saw a young man who had earned the right to make his own choices, who had proven himself capable of operating independently. Dick looked at Bruce and saw not just a mentor, but a father figure who had given him everything, who deserved honesty about what Dick was feeling. They needed to have a conversation neither wanted, about futures and identities, and what came next for a partnership that had defined them both. The wounds they carried were not just from the battles, but from the weight of impossible decisions, the people they could not save, the knowledge that this would happen again because Gotham never truly healed. They had scars that would never fully fade, trauma layered on top of existing trauma, the cost of being heroes in a city that consumed its protectors. But they also had each other, had this bond forged in blood and darkness, and unwavering trust, had the knowledge that they had faced the worst Gotham could throw at them, and survived together. The legend of the dynamic duo had been written in violence and sacrifice, and it would endure because they had made it stronger than any individual could ever be alone. The aftermath of the Rogues Gallery attack settled over Gotham like dust after an explosion, revealing cracks in the foundation that had always existed but were now impossible to ignore. Batman and Robin continued their nightly patrols, continued to answer Gordon's signal when it lit the sky, continued to fight the endless war against criminals who seemed to multiply faster than they could be stopped. But something had shifted between them, a tension that neither wanted to acknowledge, but both felt growing with each passing night. Dick was 18 now, legally an adult, and the weight of that fact hung between them like an unspoken question, demanding answers neither was ready to provide. The conflicts began small, disagreements about tactics that had always existed, but now carried sharper edges. Dick questioned Bruce's decisions more frequently, pointing out when planning became overthinking, when caution crossed into paranoia, when Bruce's need for control prevented more efficient solutions. He suggested alternative approaches that prioritized talking to criminals before fighting them, that emphasized rehabilitation over punishment, that treated Gotham's crime problem as a symptom of deeper societal issues rather than something that could be solved purely through violence. Bruce listened with growing frustration, hearing in Dick's words a naivety he thought the boy had outgrown, a softness that seemed dangerous in a city as brutal as Gotham. Their first serious argument erupted during a stakeout of a drug warehouse in the Narrows, waiting for a shipment that intelligence suggested would arrive before dawn. They had been sitting in silence for 3 hours, hidden among shipping containers, when Dick brought up a criminal they had fought the previous week. The man had been stealing to pay for his daughter's cancer treatment, desperate and terrified, and Dick thought they should have helped him find legal options instead of just beating him unconscious and leaving him for the police. Bruce responded that criminals made choices and faced consequences, that breaking the law for any reason still meant breaking the law, that showing mercy to one lawbreaker undermined the entire system they were trying to protect. Dick countered that the system was already broken, that Gotham's healthcare and economic inequality created situations where decent people felt forced into crime, that maybe Batman should spend less time punching poor people and more time addressing root causes. His voice carried an edge of challenge that Bruce had never heard directed at him before, a willingness to push back that felt like disrespect, even though logically Bruce knew Dick was just expressing his own developing philosophy. They argued in harsh whispers while criminals unloaded illegal weapons 30 yards away, both too focused on winning the debate to remember why they were there, until finally Bruce ended the discussion by ordering Dick to remain silent and follow his lead. The mission succeeded tactically but failed emotionally, both of them moving through the fight with perfect coordination while feeling miles apart. They returned to the Batcave in silence, peeling off their costumes without the usual post-patrol discussion, and Dick went to his room without saying goodnight. Alfred found Bruce alone in the cave hours later, still in costume, staring at computer screens without really seeing them. The butler offered tea and wisdom, suggesting that perhaps Dick was growing into his own man, and that fighting his independence would only push him away faster. Bruce nodded but did not seem to hear, too lost in his own concerns about what would happen when Dick no longer needed him. The pattern repeated over the following weeks, arguments breaking out during patrols about increasingly fundamental disagreements. Dick took risks Bruce considered reckless, trusting criminals who claimed to want to reform, giving second chances to people who had already burned through their first. Bruce imposed restrictions Dick found suffocating, implementing protocols and rules that treated Robin like a trainee rather than an equal partner. They were growing apart, their approaches to heroism diverging as Dick developed his own identity, separate from Batman's shadow, and neither knew how to bridge the gap without one of them surrendering principles they had come to hold as essential truths. The breaking point came during an encounter with a young thief named Jason, a street kid who had stolen the wheels off the Batmobile while it was parked in Crime Alley. Dick caught him and was about to let him go with a warning, seeing in this desperate teenager a reflection of what he himself might have become without Bruce's intervention. Bruce arrived and immediately began interrogating the boy with an intensity that frightened even Dick, demanding to know who he worked for, what gang claimed this territory, whether he had information about larger criminal operations. The kid was terrified, stammering answers while trying not to cry, and Dick finally stepped between them and told Bruce to back off. They argued right there in the alley, with the kid watching, Dick accusing Bruce of losing perspective, Bruce accusing Dick of being too soft to survive in Gotham's reality. Words were said that could not be taken back. Comparisons made to parents, both living and dead, questions raised about whether this partnership had ever been healthy or if it had always been Bruce molding Dick into a weapon. The kid ran while they were distracted, disappearing into the night, and they were left standing in Crime Alley, surrounded by the ghosts of everything that had brought them together. Dick said he needed space, and Bruce agreed with a coldness that made the words feel like rejection rather than understanding. Didion started taking solo patrols without telling Bruce, handling crimes in different parts of the city, establishing his own methods and reputation separate from Batman. He began spending more time with the Teen Titans, a group of young heroes who operated as peers rather than in the mentor-student dynamic that had defined his life for 6 years. They treated him as an equal, valued his opinions, followed his lead when the situation called for it, and gave him a taste of what heroism could look like without someone constantly looking over his shoulder. He was still Robin when he worked with them, but he was Robin the team leader, Robin the strategist, Robin who made his own calls without needing approval. Bruce noticed Dick's increasing absences but did not comment, telling himself that independence was healthy, that he had always known this day would come, that pushing Dick to stay would only breed resentment. But the silence in the Batcave felt heavier each night, the empty space where Robin should be standing, creating a void that Bruce tried to fill with work and could not. He threw himself into cases with an intensity that worried Alfred, staying out until dawn, sustaining injuries from fights he normally would have avoided, acting like a man determined to prove he did not need anyone. The mission had always been solitary in his mind, and he convinced himself he was simply returning to his true nature. Alfred watched both of them spiral, and felt powerless to stop it, seeing clearly what they refused to acknowledge. They needed each other, had saved each other from darkness years ago, and were now letting pride and fear drive them apart. He tried talking to Bruce, explaining that Dick was not abandoning him but growing up, that letting go did not mean losing someone. He tried talking to Dick, reminding him that Bruce's controlling nature came from trauma and terror of losing another person he loved. Neither listened. Both, too caught in their own pain to see past it. Both convinced they were protecting themselves from inevitable hurt. The crisis that brought everything to a head involved the Joker. Because of course, it did. That grinning demon who seemed to exist specifically to test the bonds between people who cared for each other. He had escaped Arkham again, vanishing into Gotham's underbelly, and Commissioner Gordon called Batman with information about a potential location. Bruce went alone, not because he wanted to, but because Dick was on a mission with the Titans in San Francisco, and Bruce told himself this was fine, that he could handle one psychotic clown without backup. He found the Joker in an abandoned toy factory, surrounded by traps and laughing gas, and walked directly into an ambush that had been designed specifically to exploit a solo Batman. The Joker had explosives wired throughout the building, hostages hidden in different rooms, and a timer counting down that forced Batman to make impossible choices about who to save first. Bruce moved through the factory, disarming what traps he could find, rescuing hostages one by one, all while the Joker's recorded laughter echoed from hidden speakers. He was too focused on the immediate crisis to notice the larger trap closing around him. The way each rescued hostage led him deeper into the building, further from any escape route. When he finally reached the room where the Joker was actually hiding, Bruce realized with sick certainty that he had made a catastrophic mistake. The Joker sat in a chair, surrounded by enough explosives to level the entire factory, his thumb on a detonator, his painted face split in a grin of pure delight. He explained that tonight was about proving a point, showing Batman that working alone made him vulnerable, that losing Robin had weakened him in ways he refused to acknowledge. The hostages Batman had rescued were all safe, already outside the building's blast radius, but Batman himself was trapped with no time to escape before the countdown reached 0. The Joker offered a choice. Batman could radio for help and admit he needed someone, or he could try to escape alone and probably die when the bombs detonated. Bruce refused to call for help, refused to give the Joker the satisfaction, and began working to disarm the explosives with seconds remaining on the clock. His hands moved with the precision born from decades of experience, cutting wires and removing detonators. But there were too many, and they were too spread out. He was going to die here, in an abandoned toy factory, because pride prevented him from admitting he needed backup. The thought of Dick finding out this way, learning his mentor had died alone because Bruce was too stubborn to ask for help, almost broke through his resolve. Almost, but not quite, because Bruce Wayne had spent his entire adult life convinced that needing people made you weak. Robin crashed through a skylight with perfect timing, having monitored police frequencies from San Francisco and caught Gordon's call about the Joker's location. He had flown back to Gotham immediately, knowing Bruce would go after the Joker alone, knowing his mentor well enough to predict this exact scenario. Dick moved through the factory with the speed and grace that had always been his trademark, locating and disarming bombs that Batman could not reach, creating a path to escape while also neutralizing the Joker's leverage. They worked together without needing to discuss strategy, falling back into the rhythm they had developed over years of partnership. And when the last bomb was disarmed with 3 seconds remaining, they stood together facing the Joker in silence. The clown prince of crime actually looked disappointed, his grand gesture of forcing Batman to confront his isolation completely undermined by Robin's arrival. He started to speak, to make some speech about the futility of heroism or the inevitability of chaos. But Batman hit him hard enough to break his jaw, cutting off whatever poisonous philosophy he was about to share. They secured the Joker and left him for the police, then stood outside the factory while sirens approached, both knowing they needed to have the conversation they had been avoiding for months. Dick spoke first, his voice steady, despite the adrenaline still coursing through his system. He explained that he had not abandoned Bruce, had never planned to, but that he needed space to become his own person, to develop his own approach to heroism, without constantly measuring himself against Batman's shadow. He loved Bruce, considered him the father he had needed after losing his own parents, but love did not mean remaining a child forever. He was ready to step out of the Robin identity, to become something new, but that did not mean leaving Bruce's life, just changing their relationship from mentor and student to equals and partners. Bruce listened, and for once in his life, actually heard what someone was telling him instead of filtering it through his own fears. He admitted that watching Dick grow had terrified him, that losing the partnership they had built felt like another death in a life already defined by loss. He had responded by pulling away first, trying to protect himself from inevitable hurt. But all he had accomplished was pushing away someone he loved. He apologized, the word foreign in his mouth, for trying to control Dick's growth instead of supporting it, for letting fear override trust, for forgetting that the best thing he had ever done was extend his hand to a grieving boy in an alley years ago. They stood together in the pre-dawn darkness, Batman and Robin one last time, and made their peace with the fact that this chapter of their lives was ending. Dick would continue fighting crime, would continue making Gotham safer, but he would do it as someone new, with a new name, and new costume, and new city, where he could establish himself independently. Bruce would support that decision, would be there if Dick needed him, would learn to let go without letting go completely. Alfred arrived in the Batmobile to collect them, took one look at their faces, and smiled with relief, recognizing that somehow they had found their way back to each other before the damage became irreparable. The conversation continued over the following weeks, long discussions in the Batcave about what came next, about legacy and identity, and what it meant to be a hero. Dick designed his new costume with input from Bruce and Alfred, creating something that honored his past while embracing his future. The suit was black and blue, sleek and functional, with a bird emblem across the chest that suggested a creature of the night like Batman, but lighter, more hopeful. He chose the name Nightwing, taken from a Kryptonian legend Superman had told him about, a bird that lived in darkness but sang songs of light. The name fit perfectly, capturing who Dick had become after years in Batman's shadow, someone who had learned to fight darkness while refusing to become dark himself. Bruce watched Dick prepare to leave for Bloodhaven, a city south of Gotham that needed its own protector, and felt emotions he had no words for. Pride that Dick had grown into such a capable hero, fear that something would happen without Bruce there to protect him. Hope that maybe Dick would succeed where Bruce had failed in finding balance between the mission and having a life. He gave Dick equipment and resources, access to the Batcave systems, emergency protocols for if things went wrong. He made Dick promise to call if he needed help, knowing Dick would probably be too stubborn to ask, but needing to hear the promise anyway. Their farewell happened on a rooftop, overlooking Gotham. The city they had protected together spread below them like a circuit board of lights. They did not embrace, because neither was comfortable with open affection, but they clasped hands, and the gesture carried years of meaning. Dick thanked Bruce for saving him, for giving him purpose when grief would have consumed him, for teaching him to channel rage into justice. Bruce thanked Dick for saving him right back, for reminding him that heroism was about hope as much as fear, for being the family he thought he had lost forever. Then Nightwing grappled to the next building and disappeared into the darkness, and Batman was alone again, but no longer lonely, understanding the difference for the first time in his life. The years that followed brought new challenges and new partners. Other young people who would take up the Robin mantle and learn from Batman's experience. Jason Todd appeared next, another street kid with rage and potential, and Bruce tried to apply lessons learned from Dick to avoid making the same mistakes. The boy had fire and anger that reminded Bruce of himself, and training him revealed how much Dick's optimism had balanced Bruce's darkness. Tim Drake came later, brilliant and analytical, choosing to be Robin rather than being chosen, proving that the legacy Dick had created was bigger than any single person. Damian Wayne arrived as Bruce's biological son, carrying his own complicated legacy and learning that being Robin meant more than bloodline or skill. But Dick remained the first. The one who had proven that Batman did not have to fight alone, who had transformed Bruce's solitary crusade into something larger and more meaningful. Nightwing established himself as Bloodhaven's protector, built his own reputation separate from Batman's shadow, and became the hero Bruce had always hoped he would be. They worked together occasionally, teaming up when threats required both their skills, falling back into old rhythms that felt comfortable despite years apart. Their relationship evolved into something deeper than mentor and student, becoming true partnership between equals who respected each other's different approaches to the same fundamental goal. Dick returned to Gotham frequently, checking in with Bruce and Alfred, helping train the new Robins, reminding Batman that asking for help was strength rather than weakness. He brought humor and light to the cave when he visited, told stories about Bloodhaven that made even Bruce smile, proved that it was possible to be a hero without letting the mission consume your entire identity. The other Robins looked up to him not just as the first, but as proof that you could graduate from Batman's training and become your own legend, that the apprenticeship was not the end, but the beginning of something greater. The Justice League recognized Nightwing as one of the most capable heroes operating anywhere, offering him membership and leadership roles that Dick accepted with the confidence Bruce had helped him develop. He led teams of heroes through impossible situations, made decisions that saved thousands of lives, and established himself as someone who could unite people with different philosophies toward common purpose. Superman once told Bruce that Dick was everything Bruce could have been if trauma had not hardened him, and while the comment stung, Bruce recognized its truth and felt pride that he had helped create something better than himself. But more than tactics or leadership or any measurable skill, Dick's greatest accomplishment was proving that healing was possible, that trauma did not have to define you forever, that choosing hope over darkness was not weakness but the hardest kind of strength. He carried scars from his parents' death and from years fighting Gotham's worst criminals, but he had not let those scars consume him the way Bruce's had. He maintained relationships, fell in love, experienced joy, and lived a life that extended beyond the costume. He was proof that you could fight monsters without becoming one, that dedicating yourself to justice did not require sacrificing your humanity. The subsequent Robins each brought their own strengths and challenges to the role Dick had created. Jason Todd's tragic death and resurrection taught Bruce painful lessons about the limits of what training could protect against, about the dangers of letting damaged kids fight wars they were not ready for. Tim Drake's analytical brilliance and emotional intelligence helped pull Bruce back from the darkness, Jason's death had sent him spiraling into, proving that Dick's model of balancing the mission with having a life was not a unique case, but a replicable approach. Damian Wayne's journey from arrogant assassin to heroic Robin showed that legacy was not destiny, that being Bruce's biological son mattered less than choosing to uphold the values the Robin identity represented. Each Robin added their own chapter to the legend, but they all existed because Dick Grayson had proven it was possible, had shown Batman that partnership made him stronger rather than weaker, had transformed a solitary crusade into a family business. The Bat family grew to include Batgirl and Batwoman and others who took up the mission, creating a network of heroes protecting Gotham from multiple angles, ensuring that the city would never again depend on a single person's crusade. Dick was the cornerstone of that family, the one everyone looked to as evidence that Bruce Wayne's influence could create heroes rather than just damage people. Alfred watched it all with satisfaction, seeing the family he had hoped Bruce would find finally coming together across years and struggles. The old butler had worried for decades that Bruce would die alone in some forgotten alley, his mission consuming him until nothing remained, but Dick's arrival had changed that trajectory. Now Bruce had sons and daughters, partners and allies, people who cared about him beyond his utility as Batman. When Alfred eventually passed, leaving behind recorded messages for each member of the family, his words to Dick thanked him specifically for saving Bruce Wayne by refusing to let him remain alone in his darkness. The legend of Batman and Robin had evolved into something larger than either of its original members, becoming a symbol of hope and partnership that inspired heroes around the world. But at its core, the story remained simple, a tale of two broken people who found each other in darkness and built something beautiful from their shared pain. Bruce had taught Dick to fight, and Dick had taught Bruce to live. Batman had given Robin purpose, and Robin had given Batman family. Together they had proven that even in Gotham's eternal night, even in a city that destroyed everything beautiful, love and trust could survive if you were brave enough to accept them. The years transformed Gotham in ways both visible and subtle, the city's endless cycle of crime and punishment continuing with a rhythm that had become almost predictable. Batman remained its dark protector. Older now, his body carrying the accumulated damage of decades spent fighting wars that never truly ended. The cape and cowl had become synonymous with justice in a city that had little of it, and Bruce Wayne wore that responsibility like chains he had forged himself. He trained harder to compensate for aging reflexes, relied more on strategy than brute force, accepted that his body would eventually fail him even as his determination never wavered. The mission consumed him as it always had, but now there were people who pulled him back from the edge, who reminded him that Bruce Wayne still existed beneath the mask. Dick Grayson had become one of the most respected heroes in the world, Nightwing's reputation extending far beyond Bloodhaven's borders. He led the Titans, worked with the Justice League, and maintained connections with the vast network of heroes who had emerged in the years since he first put on the Robin costume. But Gotham remained his home in ways that transcended geography, and he returned frequently, drawn by bonds that time and distance could not weaken. His relationship with Bruce had matured into something that neither could have predicted when they first met, evolving beyond mentor and student into a partnership between equals who genuinely respected each other's different approaches to heroism. The evolution of their dynamic became most apparent during crises that threatened not just Gotham but the entire world. Situations where the Justice League needed Batman's tactical genius and Nightwing's ability to unite heroes with conflicting philosophies. They worked together seamlessly during these emergencies, Bruce creating strategies that Dick then communicated to teams with the charisma and emotional intelligence Bruce lacked. Other heroes watched them coordinate and saw not just professional efficiency but genuine affection, the kind of bond that only forms when people have saved each other's lives so many times they have lost count. Superman once commented that watching Batman and Nightwing work together was like watching a conversation conducted entirely through movement, two people so in tune they barely needed words. But their partnership was tested in ways that went beyond physical danger, challenged by philosophical differences that had only deepened as both men aged and became more certain of their own beliefs. Dick believed in rehabilitation and second chances, dedicated significant time and resources to helping former criminals reintegrate into society, convinced that people could change if given proper support. Bruce remained skeptical of such efforts, his experience showing him that most criminals were predators who would never stop hunting, that mercy shown to the guilty often resulted in more innocent victims. They argued about these differences regularly, sometimes with heat but more often with a weary acceptance of people who had been having the same debate for decades and knew neither would convince the other. One particular argument erupted over Jason Todd, the second Robin, who had died and then returned as the Red Hood, a vigilante who killed criminals rather than simply stopping them. Dick wanted to bring Jason back into the family, to help him heal from the trauma of his death and resurrection, to prove that even someone who had fallen as far as Jason could find redemption. Bruce maintained that Jason had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed, that killing criminals made him no different from the people they fought, that accepting his methods would undermine everything the Bat family represented. They stood in the Batcave arguing while rain hammered against the ground above, both exhausted from patrol, both too stubborn to concede ground on principles they considered fundamental. Dick pointed out that Bruce himself had nearly killed the Joker multiple times, that the line Bruce drew between acceptable and unacceptable violence was thinner than he wanted to admit, that everyone who put on a costume and punched criminals was engaging in violence that polite society would consider unacceptable. Bruce countered that intent mattered, that there was a fundamental difference between stopping someone and executing them, that the moment they started killing was the moment they became the very thing they had sworn to fight. The argument went in circles for hours, neither convincing the other, until finally Dick said something that cut through Bruce's defenses like a knife through silk. He asked whether Bruce's code was really about morality, or whether it was about control, about maintaining a rigid system of rules, because Bruce was terrified of what would happen if he ever let himself cross that line. He suggested that maybe Bruce's refusal to kill had less to do with protecting the innocent and more to do with protecting himself from his own capacity for darkness, that the entire crusade was built on fear of what Bruce might become if he ever allowed himself to unleash the rage he had been carrying since his parents died in Crime Alley. The words hung in the cave like smoke after an explosion, and Bruce had no response because somewhere deep down he recognized the truth in Dick's accusation. They did not speak for 3 weeks after that fight, the longest they had gone without contact since Dick left Gotham years earlier. Bruce threw himself into patrol with renewed intensity, pushing his aging body beyond safe limits, sustaining injuries that took longer to heal than they once had. Dick focused on Bloodhaven and his work with the Titans, trying to convince himself that he did not need Bruce's approval, that he had outgrown needing validation from the man who had raised him. Alfred watched both of them suffer, and finally intervened, calling Dick to inform him that Bruce had been hospitalized after a fight with Bane had reopened old spinal injuries, that he was refusing proper treatment because he insisted on returning to patrol immediately. Dick arrived at Wayne Manor within hours, finding Bruce in the cave against medical advice, preparing to go out despite barely being able to walk. They looked at each other across the distance of the cave, and Dick saw what he had been refusing to acknowledge for years. Bruce was getting old, his body breaking down from decades of punishment, and one day he would die, And all the arguments and philosophical differences would mean nothing compared to the fact that Dick would have lost the closest thing to a father he had known since his parents fell. He crossed the cave and embraced Bruce, something neither of them was comfortable with, but both desperately needed, and they stood together in silence while Alfred discreetly left them alone. Bruce admitted that Dick had been right about the code being partially about fear, about control, about maintaining rigid rules because flexibility terrified him. He explained that every night he put on the cowl, he felt the rage that had driven him since he was 8 years old, felt the desire to hurt criminals in ways that went beyond stopping them, and the only thing preventing him from becoming a monster was the line he had drawn and refused to cross. Killing was not just morally wrong in Bruce's mind, but existentially dangerous, the first step down a slope that ended with him becoming everything he hated. Dick listened and understood in ways he had not before, recognized that what looked like inflexibility was actually constant struggle, that Bruce's code was not about judging others but about saving himself. They reconciled not by resolving their philosophical differences, but by accepting them, acknowledging that they had different approaches to the same fundamental goal, and that disagreement did not invalidate the bond they shared. Dick convinced Bruce to take time off for proper healing, actually recruiting other members of the Bat family to enforce the medical leave when Bruce inevitably tried to return to patrol too early. For 6 weeks, Nightwing operated in Gotham alongside the current Robin and Batgirl, protecting the city while Batman recovered, proving that the mission could continue even when its founder was sidelined. Bruce hated every moment of forced inactivity, but could not deny a strange relief at temporarily setting down a burden he had carried for decades. During that recovery period, Bruce and Dick spent time together outside their costumes, something they had rarely done since Dick left Gotham years earlier. They attended charity functions as Bruce Wayne and his ward, maintaining the fiction that their relationship was simply wealthy philanthropist and former circus performer, rather than the infinitely more complex reality. They trained together in the cave, with Dick taking the role of instructor for once, teaching Bruce modified techniques that would place less stress on his healing spine. They had dinner with Alfred, actual sit-down meals where they talked about things beyond crime and tactics. And Bruce discovered that Dick had become someone genuinely interesting, with opinions and experiences that extended far beyond vigilante work. One night they sat in the Manor's library, a room Bruce rarely used, despite it containing thousands of books. And Dick asked whether Bruce ever regretted taking him in, whether he ever wished he had let the system handle a grieving circus kid instead of transforming him into a child soldier. Bruce considered the question with the seriousness it deserved, acknowledging that he had made mistakes in Dick's training, that exposing a child to Gotham's darkness had caused damage no amount of good intentions could justify. But he could not regret their partnership, could not wish away the years they had fought together, because Dick had saved him in ways that had nothing to do with physical danger. Before Robin, Bruce had been drowning in isolation and rage, convinced he would die alone, having accomplished nothing permanent. Dick had given him family, had shown him that legacy could be measured in lives changed rather than criminals punished, had proven that even someone as damaged as Bruce Wayne could be a father figure if he tried hard enough. Dick responded that he could not regret it either, despite the nightmares and scars and years of his life spent fighting criminals instead of having normal childhood experiences. Bruce had given him purpose when grief would have consumed him, had channeled his rage into something constructive rather than letting it destroy him from within. The training had been brutal and the missions dangerous, but Dick had emerged from it all as someone capable of making real differences in the world, someone who could look at himself in the mirror and feel proud of what he had become. They were both broken people who had found each other at exactly the right moment, and their partnership had created something more valuable than either could have built alone. The conversation shifted to legacy and what would happen when Bruce could no longer be Batman, a topic he had been avoiding for years but could no longer ignore, given his body's increasing protests. Dick made clear he had no interest in taking over the mantle permanently, that Nightwing was who he had become, and Batman was who Bruce was, that trying to step into that role would mean losing himself. But he promised to be there when the time came, to help choose and train whoever would eventually inherit the cowl, to ensure that Batman's mission continued even after Bruce Wayne could no longer physically embody it. They discussed possibilities and contingencies, planning for futures neither wanted but both knew were inevitable, finding strange comfort in accepting mortality together. The years continued their relentless march, bringing new challenges and familiar enemies, victories and losses that accumulated like layers of sediment forming rock. Bruce returned to active duty as Batman but accepted limitations he once would have denied, delegating more to the extended Bat family, trusting others to handle situations he would have insisted on managing personally. Dick visited more frequently, ostensibly to coordinate on cases but really to check on Bruce, to make sure the old man was not pushing himself to death, to spend time with family before time ran out. Their relationship deepened into something neither could fully articulate, a bond forged in trauma and strengthened through decades of shared struggle, more profound than friendship and more complex than simple father-son dynamics. The Joker's final attack came without warning, as his best schemes always did, a coordinated assault that targeted every member of the Bat family simultaneously across multiple cities. He had been planning it for years, studying their patterns and relationships, identifying vulnerabilities that could be exploited to cause maximum psychological damage. The attack was not designed to kill them, but to break them, to destroy the bonds that held the family together, to prove his thesis that all relationships were temporary and all loyalty was illusion. He separated them from each other, trapped them in scenarios designed to exploit their specific traumas, forced them to make impossible choices between saving each other and saving innocent victims. The mind found himself in a recreation of crime alley, surrounded by hired actors playing his parents over and over, making him watch their deaths on infinite loop. While the Joker's laughter echoed from speakers, Nightwing was trapped in a circus tent where acrobats in flying Grayson costumes performed while rigging visibly failed above them, forcing him to relive his parents' death while knowing he could not save these performers either. The other Robins and Batgirls faced their own personalized hells, scenarios crafted from intimate knowledge of their worst fears and deepest regrets. The Joker had done his homework, and he wanted them to understand that he knew them better than they knew themselves. But the Joker had made one fundamental miscalculation in his elaborate torture, underestimating the strength of the bonds he was trying to break. The Bat family had spent years training together, learning to trust each other, building communication systems that went beyond simple technology. They broke free from their individual traps by working together, coordinating escapes across distances, each person's success contributing to others' survival. Dick talked Bruce through his psychological assault, using techniques they had developed during shared meditation sessions, while Bruce guided Dick past his trauma, using anchors they had established years ago. The family that the Joker thought he could shatter instead proved unbreakable, emerging from his carefully constructed nightmare battered but united. They tracked the Joker to Arkham Asylum, to the cell where he had spent so many years between escapes, and found him waiting with that terrible smile splitting his white face. He congratulated them on surviving his test, seemed genuinely impressed that they had overcome scenarios designed to destroy weaker bonds, and then revealed the final layer of his scheme. The entire asylum was rigged to explode, and the detonator was wired to his heart, meaning they could not stop the countdown without killing him. It was the ultimate test of Batman's code, forcing him to choose between his principles and the lives of everyone in the building, giving him no option that did not require sacrifice. Batman stood before the Joker, and for the first time in their decades-long conflict, Bruce saw his enemy with absolute clarity. The Joker was not chaos incarnate or a force of nature, was not some cosmic test of Batman's principles. He was just a broken man who had built an identity from other people's pain, who needed Batman to validate his existence by providing an eternal opponent. The Joker wanted to prove that everyone was one bad day away from becoming him, wanted Batman to kill him, and prove all morality was contingent and all codes were breakable. But standing there with his family around him, with Dick at his side, and Alfred monitoring from the cave, and all the other heroes he had trained, ready to support him, Bruce understood something fundamental about his entire crusade. The code was not about the Joker or any criminal, was not about proving anything to anyone external. It was about who Bruce Wayne chose to be. Despite trauma and rage, about maintaining humanity in the face of inhumanity, about protecting the one part of himself that Crime Alley had not destroyed. Dick had been right years ago during their argument. The code was about control and fear, but those were not weaknesses but strengths. The conscious choice to impose limits on oneself specifically because unlimited power would corrupt. Batman did not kill because Batman chose not to kill, and no external circumstance could force him to abandon that choice. He disarmed the bomb without killing the Joker, using techniques he had been developing for decades, specifically for this scenario, accepting that it would take longer and carry more risk, but unwilling to compromise his principles for efficiency. The entire Bat family worked together on the hundreds of explosive devices, racing against the countdown, trusting each other absolutely, and when the last device was neutralized with seconds remaining, they stood together in the ruins of Arkham Asylum victorious. The Joker looked genuinely disappointed, his grand philosophical statement reduced to just another failed scheme, and Batman left him for the authorities without any dramatic final confrontation, because the Joker did not deserve even that much acknowledgement. The aftermath of that night rippled through the entire superhero community. The story of how the Bat family had overcome their personalized nightmares becoming legend. But for Bruce and Dick, the real meaning was more personal and profound. They had proven to themselves and each other that the bonds they had forged were stronger than trauma. That family was not something that could be broken by external pressure. That the partnership they had begun decades ago in an alley where a grieving boy met a broken man had created something that would outlast both of them. They did not need to discuss it or analyze it, simply understood on a level deeper than words that they had passed through fire together and emerged intact. Bruce began seriously planning his retirement after that, accepting that he could not be Batman forever, that his body was breaking down, and his reflexes were slowing, and eventually he would make a mistake that got himself or someone else killed. He worked with Dick to identify potential successors, evaluated members of the Bat family for who had the temperament and dedication to carry the mission forward. They developed training protocols and succession plans, prepared for the day when Bruce Wayne would hang up the cowl permanently, ensuring that Batman would continue protecting Gotham even after its founder could no longer physically embody the symbol. Dick knew that day was approaching, could see it in how Bruce moved more carefully, relied more on gadgets than physical prowess, took longer to recover from injuries that once would have barely slowed him down. They never directly discussed mortality, because neither wanted to acknowledge the elephant in the room, but it hung between them like smoke, the understanding that their time together was finite and growing shorter. Dick found himself visiting Gotham more frequently, taking cases that did not really require Nightwing's involvement, spending evenings in the cave just being present while Bruce worked at the computer. Alfred noticed and said nothing, understanding that Dick was preparing for loss, the only way he knew how, by cherishing what remained. The night Bruce Wayne officially retired as Batman was quiet and anticlimactic. No dramatic final battle or grand announcement, just a decision made in the cave with Dick and Alfred as witnesses. Bruce removed the cowl for the last time, handed it to the person he and Dick had chosen as his successor, and spoke words that acknowledged he had done everything he could, that the mission now belonged to younger heroes, that he was ready to step back and trust others to continue what he had started. Dick stood beside him, one hand on Bruce's shoulder, providing support and solidarity, and together they watched a new Batman emerge from the shadows to protect a city that would always need protecting. Bruce Wayne's life after Batman was strange and difficult, filled with restless energy that had nowhere to go, decades of purpose suddenly absent. He threw himself into Wayne Enterprises and charitable work, used his wealth and influence to address the systemic issues Dick had always argued were root causes of crime, discovered that he could still make differences without the costume. Dick visited constantly during those first months, worried Bruce would spiral into depression or try to reclaim the cowl, but Bruce surprised him by actually adapting, finding new meaning in different kinds of heroism. They worked together on social programs and criminal rehabilitation initiatives, Bruce bringing resources and connections while Dick provided emotional intelligence and street-level understanding. Alfred Pennyworth passed peacefully in his sleep at age 94, surrounded by the family he had helped create. His last words, thanking Bruce and Dick for giving him purpose and love during decades of service. They buried him in the Wayne family plot. The butler, who had been more father than employee, receiving honors usually reserved for blood relatives. Bruce and Dick stood together at the graveside, both crying without shame, mourning the man who had held them together through countless crises, who had believed in their mission when no one else understood. The loss created a hole in Wayne Manor that could never be filled, but it also reinforced how precious family was, how important it was to tell people you loved them before time ran out. The years softened Bruce in ways that would have been unimaginable during his Batman days. The rigid intensity that had defined him for decades gradually mellowing into something approaching contentment. He became a mentor to young heroes in ways that did not involve physical training, offering tactical advice and emotional support, serving as the wise elder statesman that the superhero community could turn to for guidance. Dick watched this transformation with amazement and pride, seeing Bruce become the person he always had the potential to be once the mission no longer consumed him entirely. They had dinner together weekly, actual normal dinners where they talked about politics and books and life. The relationship that had begun in trauma finally evolving into simple companionship. Dick Grayson continued as Nightwing into his 40s. Still one of the most capable heroes operating anywhere, his acrobatic skills maintained through dedication and proper self-care that Bruce had never practiced. He eventually married and started a family, named his first son John after his father and his second Richard after himself, giving them the childhood he had lost, but ensuring they understood the legacy they inherited. Bruce was honorary grandfather, visiting frequently, teaching Dick's children about justice and responsibility without the harsh edges that had characterized his training of Dick decades earlier. The cycle was different this time, gentler but no less meaningful, proof that trauma did not have to perpetuate itself across generations. Bruce Wayne died at 78, his body finally giving out after decades of punishment, surrounded by family in Wayne Manor, with Dick holding one hand and the current Batman holding the other. His last words were not dramatic or profound, just a simple thank you to Dick for everything, for saving him when he needed it most, for becoming the son he never thought he would have, for proving that even someone as broken as Bruce Wayne could create something beautiful from pain and darkness. Dick responded that Bruce had saved him first, that everything Dick had become was because Bruce had extended his hand in an alley decades ago, that their partnership had been the defining relationship of his life, and he would carry it forward until his own final breath. The funeral was massive, attended by heroes and dignitaries from around the world, everyone who had been touched by Batman's mission coming to pay respects to the man behind the mask. Dick delivered the eulogy, speaking about Bruce Wayne rather than Batman, humanizing someone who had been myth for so long that people forgot the man underneath. He talked about Bruce's flaws and virtues, his capacity for love despite spending years convinced he was incapable of it, his growth from traumatized child to feared vigilante to beloved mentor and friend. He told the truth about their relationship, about how they had saved each other from darkness, about how Bruce Wayne's greatest legacy was not the criminals he stopped, but the family he created. The Gotham mourned Batman for months, the city recognizing that an era had ended, that the Dark Knight who had protected them for decades was finally gone. But the mission continued as Bruce had intended, new heroes taking up the mantle he had created, the Bat family expanding to include people who had never met Bruce Wayne but understood what Batman represented. Dick served as the bridge between generations, carrying forward lessons learned from the original Batman while helping newer heroes avoid the mistakes he and Bruce had made. He told stories about Bruce to anyone who would listen, ensuring that people understood Batman as more than just a symbol, keeping alive the memory of a complicated man who had done his best in an impossible situation. Years later, when Dick Grayson was himself an old man watching his own children carry forward the heroic legacy, he would stand on a rooftop overlooking Gotham and remember a 12-year-old boy watching his parents fall. Remember a stranger in a suit offering his hand. Remember descending into a cave and finding purpose. Remember the first time he wore the Robin costume, the fear and excitement, Bruce's anxiety barely concealed behind the cowl. Remember fights and arguments, victories and defeats, moments of terror and triumph shared with someone who had believed in him when he was just a grieving kid with nothing left to lose. The dynamic duo had existed for only a fraction of both their lives, measured in years rather than decades, but it had defined everything that came after. Batman had taught Robin to fight, and Robin had taught Batman to live. Together they had proven that partnership was stronger than isolation, that family could be forged from tragedy, that even in Gotham's endless darkness, two people refusing to give up could create light. The legend they built together would outlast both of them, inspiring generations of heroes who would never meet either man, but would carry forward their mission of protecting the innocent and seeking justice in an unjust world. In the end, the story of Batman and Robin was not about the crimes they stopped or the villains they defeated, though those accomplishments filled volumes. It was about two broken people who found each other at exactly the right moment, who saved each other from darkness by refusing to let the other drown alone, who built something beautiful and permanent from shared trauma and unconditional trust. It was about a man learning to be human and a boy learning to be a hero, about a family forged in fire and bonds that transcended blood. It was about hope, surviving in the darkest possible place, love existing despite every reason to give up on connection, legacy measured not in victories but in lives touched and changed forever. The legend of the dynamic duo would echo through history, long after both men were gone, a story told and retold about partnership and redemption, about how even the darkest night needed light beside him, about how a broken man and a shattered boy made each other whole. And somewhere in Gotham's eternal night, where shadows still wage war against darkness, their spirits would remain, watching over the city they had protected together, ensuring that no one would ever have to fight alone again. For in that first leap from the rooftops, when a boy became a bird and a lone warrior became part of something greater, they did not just create a partnership, they created hope itself. And that hope would burn eternal, a light that no darkness could ever extinguish. The end.